We are joined now by Nick Osen. He is a Wisconsin beat reporter for 24/7 Sports. What's up, Nick?
Guys, thank you so much for having me. I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Good. Opponent previews, man. So we're kind of gluttons for punishment. So we like to start with the proverbial thorns in our side. So, I mean, why not start with Badger Nation?
Absolutely. No, it's going to be, I think, a really exciting season. And, from what I've read, I'm sure you guys are pretty excited out there about some of the potential there, too.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, full disclosure, I spent a couple of times in Madison with those guys recruiting my kid last year. So I was at spring practice a few times, and you're going to have some new faces on that staff, but by and large, it was pretty easy to see why Coach Fickell is so well thought of as he kind of continues the build. Let's start with the staff and a couple of new faces and new places for Coach Fickell.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, there are some massive additions, and they've really shown themselves not only with the new team, of course, but on the recruiting trail as well. I'll start with offensive line coach A.J. Blazik. Now, he came in, obviously some connections around the industry, and there was a buzz about him, relationship builder and a good developer. But like I said, he's also brought a lot of kind of excitement, charm to the recruiting trail. So the O-line, there'll be a new coach. Wide out, Coach Kenny Guyton, who's also really found some success recruiting, and I think he's done a really great job of connecting and developing so far. A defensive line coach, E.J. Whitlow, who has kind of found his success as a developer at a couple different stops, including Air Force, getting some guys to the NFL. So that's a big addition. And then Alex Grinch in the secondary. Now, fortunately for Coach Grinch, he's coming in to work with some safeties that are already stars, including Hunter Wohler, obviously one of the biggest names for Wisconsin. So those are some new additions. And so far, very, very overwhelmingly positive with these guys, I would say, especially Coach Blazik and Coach Guyton.
I was blown away by your former co-defensive coordinator and safeties coach, Coach Hitchler, especially how he worked in tandem with Coach Tressel. Is it a blessing, kind of? Because we're talking about similar things in Nebraska secondary, too, replacing Coach Cooper with Coach Butler, where we're fortunate to have some experienced, good players on the back end that could make that transition a little more seamless. But Hitchler was a stud.
Yeah, I think fortunately, and that was an opportunity for him, but I think for Wisconsin, I think they're fortunate. They've got older guys back there, you know, so it's still a transition, but it's not as tough. You've got Wohler. You've got a guy that's been around 4 or 5 years in Kamoy Latu.
Hamlin's a stud.
Brown is now entering
Hallmark,
year 3. Yeah, absolutely. Hallman at corner. So I think it's been really seamless. And what stood out to me with Coach Grinch is he's kind of really been in that teaching role. Obviously, you guys with your experience and going through recruiting, how important that is to still be able to teach one-on-one, be a technician within kind of your craft. And so I think that's what he's done, obviously, with a DC at USC. So plenty of opportunities for him in Madison. And frankly, guys, I wouldn't be shocked at all if the secondary is the best spot on the entire team.
Nick, I'm curious there's a lot of similarities between what Wisconsin has gone through in terms of coaching change and transition and what Nebraska's going through. What are your expectations for a year 2 progression under the second year of Luke Fickell?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think, generally speaking, right, for the fan base, I think it is just like to continue this positive upward trend, recruiting, translating that to the football field. And from what my readers really say, they're talking about winning like 1 or 2 at least of these marquee games, right? Whether that's Bama coming to town, at USC, Oregon, I think at Nebraska is going to be a really good game, and at Iowa. But for me personally, getting the chance to, of course, see some of spring football, obviously cover this team so deeply, I've got expectations a little bit higher just because I know what the potential is. The over-under line for this team was 6.5 wins. So obviously, if you say the over, that's about 7. I still think that's a little low. I think success would be probably 7 to 8 wins, but winning at least one of those marquee battles. And frankly, the Badgers are starting to pick up a little bit of steam as kind of like a sleeper contender in the Big Ten Conference after a couple of maybe the more expected teams this season.
He's had a hard time doing it, but it's a Wisconsin thing. even under Longo, who had success running the football at Carolina as well. How important is the emergence of another back, or at least in addition to health and getting back Ches Malusi?
Really, really important. And frankly, he looked healthy. He's back to himself. But I'll also mention a name that I think maybe not enough people have been talking about or maybe even know about. Another veteran tailback, Howie Walker, came in from Oklahoma. And, you know, he dealt with injury throughout some of his career, was actually a walk-on with the Sooners. And now he and Malusi are just going to be this kind of, you know, thunder and lightning veteran backfield. And I feel like they each kind of present some different strengths. Malusi, really complete back. I'm so glad to see him healthy because he's just been a stalwart and really a leader for this program ever since he came in from Clemson. So I think those two guys are really going to help the run game. And obviously, I'm expecting a pretty big year for Coach Phil Longo with the run game too.
How important will Ashcraft and his steadiness as TE1 be for the steadiness of Van Dyke?
Yeah, I think for him, you know, I think it's fortunate that he was able to get a lot of looks last year so young. I think that's a room where, you know, you kind of open things up a little bit more now that it's year 2 with Longo, obviously Coach Fickle, and in this system. I think Tyler Van Dyke is going to lean on those tight ends a little bit when necessary. I think it's fortunate that there are some big-time receivers now, but I think that's only going to open things up for a guy like Tuck Ashcraft, like you mentioned, or JT Seagraves, who's kind of a flashy younger player, but who's very complete with his athleticism. I think Riley Nowakowski is a veteran there, too, that can do a little bit of everything. So I feel like that's a room, I'll say specifically tight ends and running backs, I think are going to have a really nice kind of bounce back year in 2024.
We're talking with Nick Osen. He covers Wisconsin for 24/7 Sports. Let's talk about Tyler Van Dyke. Obviously had a really good redshirt freshman campaign at Miami, never really matched those levels again in his next 2 years. What does he need to be within this offense for Wisconsin to reach those levels that you were talking about in terms of a successful season?
Yeah, I think he needs to do 2 things, guys. I think he obviously, you know, needs to play well, be a good quarterback. That's obvious. But I think number 2 is just try not to do too much. You know, maybe cut down the turnovers, because with the run game, like I mentioned, and the defense that I personally expect to be a top at least 3 or 4 unit within the conference with some of the moves that they made, I don't think he has to maybe do as much as he did as a young player at Miami. I think to show that arm strength when you need, trust the offense. I think he's done a really nice job transitioning into this Phil Longo offense. It wasn't necessarily the easiest in the first couple weeks, but then I think he really settled in spring ball. I've been impressed with how he's kind of become a little bit more of a leader. So I think as long as he just trusts his reads, and knows, yeah, you've got that arm strength, you can take the deep shots here and there, but maybe don't need to force them. I think that's going to be the best thing, not only for the offense, but for his development. Because from what I understand, I think that he is still thought of as a potential NFL talent. But like you said, some of those numbers were a little bit higher early on, and he's, of course, looking to get back there in Madison.
So safe to say that is Green wide receiver 1?
I would definitely go with Will Pauling on that one.
Believe me, we've seen him in our sleep, so I got no problems watching guys work in the slot on third down. Like I get it.
Yeah. He had a heck of a breakout campaign last season, and just from watching him and seeing some of his workouts too, he's only going to get better. But I like that you asked about Green, right? Because he's a little bit forgotten at times. He dealt with an injury here or there last season, but you saw some of his potential. You certainly saw it in the bowl game against LSU, the massive touchdowns that made that a really, really good game. So I put him up there. And then, I'll tell you guys, there's a lot of talent really kind of in that slot area. Obviously, that's a key cog in Phil Longo's offense, and Badgers are not shying away from that one.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I had a couple young guys that came over in a recruiting deal from Cincinnati, if I remember right. You had a couple guys in the portal, and I'm watching these practices, and they were making tough catch after tough catch, and it was all these little quick twitchy guys like working in the slot. I was like, oh, this could be interesting over time, but they were so young last spring.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, DB, because also you don't necessarily see that all the time at Wisconsin, right? When you think of those offenses usually a little more ground and pound, fixate with the tight ends and things like that. But I've really enjoyed watching it. Pauling's obviously a guy. Another young player probably that you had seen is Tretch Kekayuna, came in the class of 2023.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's primed for a pretty massive career. And then we'll see how much this guy plays coming into the year. But Kyan Barry Johnson, a really fast, tough wideout from Illinois. I think, like I said, they're stacking talent. And obviously these guys aren't here yet. But in the class of 2025, that's really continuing too. So I think Coach Guyton, Coach Longo, and the staff have done a nice job of adding to that because, like I said, it is so important in Phil Longo's offense.
That's Nick Osen. He covers Wisconsin for 24/7 Sports. Nick, we appreciate the time, and I'm sure we'll talk to you again later in the year.
Good stuff, Nick. Appreciate you.
Would love to do a preview, guys. Thanks for having me.
You got it.